Welcome back to Telling God's Story. This week we're going to be talking about the kings of Israel. Now it's interesting that we're talking about the kings of Israel at all because Israel always had a king. That is to say, God himself was Israel's king. God's intention was that he would be Israel's king, and yet throughout the period of the Judges, Israel interacted with all of these foreign nations, and it led them to wanting to have a king, an earthly king just like the nations around them. The book of 1 Samuel describes how it is that Israel came to receive a king. The book initially starts with God calling Samuel as a young man to be his prophet, to speak for him to the people, and the people could speak to God through Samuel, or they did speak to God through Samuel. We might call Samuel Israel's final judge. While Samuel more or less ruled over the people insofar as he was the one speaking for God to them and leading them in defending themselves against the nations around them, the people come to observe that Samuel's children are not suited to follow him. And so they tell Samuel, give to us a king. We read about this and God's response to this in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So throughout their history, God had interacted with his people through prophets, through people that he had called to speak for him to the people of Israel. Moses might be a chief example of this, but we see this throughout their history because God was to be their king. So the prophets served as sort of an intermediary by which the king spoke to his people, but that wasn't good enough for Israel. That wasn't what they wanted. They wanted an earthly king, just like the nations around them. And so they tell Samuel to tell God, give us a king. And God tells them exactly how it's going to be. God was their king, but he served them. He protected them. He provided for them. An earthly king, like they wanted, an earthly king would demand to be served, to be cared for, to be given. The earthly king would take from the people of Israel, and yet this is what they wanted. And so this is what God would give to them. In the upcoming sessions, as we talk about the later kings of Israel, we'll see that they had many kings who were terrible, who did not follow the Lord, who did not serve the people well at all, who simply did take from them. But this first king that they would receive is a man named Saul. Saul was anointed by Samuel, and initially he's humble and he comes across almost kind of meek, skittish about the idea that he would be the king. He remarks of himself that he's of the tribe of Benjamin, the least amongst the tribes, and yet he's going to be the king. So he comes across initially as humble, but over time it becomes very clear that power does to him what power often does. It starts to corrupt or overwhelm a person's good sense and lead them into temptation and lead them into falling into temptation. In Saul's case, it leads him to go ahead and do things his own way rather than doing things the way that God has called him to do. We read in one battle where God tells him to destroy everything, but he takes the spoils from the battle, and it leads to God rejecting Saul. This rejection that God has for Saul leads God to tell Samuel to anoint a new king, to anoint a son of Jesse named David to be king. Now this causes a lot of friction because Saul is still the king at this point in time. But God has chosen David, and God grants David success. We see perhaps the most readily apparent example of this when David confronts Goliath. We read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 17. You perhaps remember this scene from your Sunday school days or from reading it just a few minutes ago, but Goliath stands there looming over the armies of Israel, insulting them, insulting their honor, and by extension insulting the honor of the God of Israel. And yet none of the Israelites will stand against him. Not even King Saul is willing to stand against Goliath until David, this shepherd boy, son of Jesse, steps forward and is incensed that this heathen would insult the God of Israel. And so he volunteers. He says he is willing to fight against Goliath, and yet he doesn't do so with armor and swords and shields. Instead, David fights with stones and sling. By any objective measure, it seems obvious who will win this fight, until we recall that it's not David really who's fighting, but it's the God of Israel who is fighting. And so Goliath soon falls, felled by a simple stone, and David wins the day, and Israel, by extension, wins the day, because God has won the day. Now, David loyally serves King Saul, but jealousy over David rises up in Saul until it gets to the point that he seeks to kill David, to put David to death. He seeks and pursues David as David flees so that David's not forced to kill his king, basically. Several times David has opportunity to do so, but he will not because he's acting faithfully, recognizing that God is the one who had installed Saul as king, and so it's up to God to be the one to uninstall Saul as king, essentially. And David's reign, much support is rising up for David amongst the people, but it will have to wait until such time as God sets out to remove Saul from the kinghood. This eventually does happen as Saul is grievously wounded in an ill-fought battle, and he actually falls upon his own sword so that he doesn't fall into the hands of the Philistines. So ends the reign of Israel's first human king. And so begins the reign of perhaps Israel's greatest human king, King David. We'll look at David and God's relationship to David next time as we continue telling God's story.